I have made various Angepinion videos related to visual novels before, but this one may be my hottest take yet. So I was looking at a poll on Reddit, and it made me realize something. Apparently, the majority of people tend to read all available routes in a visual novel no matter the genre. I want to use this video to argue that, in fact, in many cases, you do not have to read every route in a visual novel to get the full enjoyment. Before I continue, a huge shout out to the local weeb for doing the editing for this video. Now, in all fairness, I admit for the longest time, I was one of those people who felt like I had to read every single route just so I could get my money's worth or have the fairest opinion on the visual novel. But over time, as I've read over 100 visual novels, I've realized there's so many cases where a route did not improve my opinion on a character, nor did I feel it was important to the story, if there even was one. Once I saw some online friends only read 1 to 3 routes that they actually cared for, I started to experiment myself and realized that maybe I don't need to read every single route, and I started to do that much more often these days. So I'm going to start by talking about what I think is the easiest genre to not read every route for, the moege or slice of life heavy visual novels. To me, these are exactly the type of visual novels that are made to not force people to read every single route, since outside of some small plot threads depending on the VN, at the end of the day, the pure intent is to have a romance arc with a specific love interest fulfilled by the end. While reading all 4 to 6 routes can provide interesting perspectives, many times moege purely rely on the likability of the love interests for the enjoyment on their route. Usually the common route is good enough to figure out the likability of the heroine or love interest before considering a route. For me, a perfect example of a moege that I read using the not reading all routes standard was Riddle Joker, and I heavily enjoyed it much more because of it. Throughout the common route, even though I liked the setting, I ended up not really caring for the vast majority of the heroines outside of one, Maou. She pretty easily checked off many personality traits that I like, while all the other main heroines were either boring or annoying. I did not regret this choice, as Mayu's route ended up being one of the best Yuzu visual novel routes I've read in terms of having a good mix of romance and story. If I had forced myself to read the other routes, I have a feeling I would have rated the visual novel quite a bit lower. For example, despite Ayase's route supposedly having the best plot, I wasn't ready to deal with typical tsundere violence stuff. Apparently a lot of people hyped up Nanami as one of the best non-blood related sister characters, but I just thought she was annoying. That said, despite my personal experience with Riddle Joker, I think my sentiments generally apply to all the other Yuzusoft visual novels. Just going off of popular opinion, in Son of a Witch, people tend to either like Nene or Meguru the most by far. With Senren Banka, people tend to like Murasame or Mako the most, and in Cafe Stella, people tend to like Natsume the most by far. But popularity aside, Yuzusoft generally tends to write their routes, making them fit the character's personality and moe-ness, if that's even a word. So if you choose like maybe 1 or 2 of them at most, and just read their routes, I'd say that's personally more than enough to get enough enjoyment out of a Yuzusoft title. No need to bring down your enjoyment of routes with characters you don't really care about. But it's not like Yuzusoft is the only moege company out there. Like basically any moege or romance slice of life heavy visual novel without any route locks, I see basically no reasons to force yourself to read all of them if you only like 1, 2, or 3 or so of the main heroines. In fact, I could even go in another direction. For example, in Marshmallow All the Way Home and the developer, Marmalade in general, they tend to have extremely good common routes to the point where I could argue that the common routes themselves are the selling point and anything else is extra. Despite the fact that I did overall like all 4 main heroines in Marshmallow All the Way Home, I found that their actual character routes were neutral at best for the characters and slightly negative for them at worst. Almost all of them did get character development in the common route, especially Sasa and Raiha. The only character who got more of their character development in their actual character route was Kanon, but it was backstory plot that was coming from a mile away and added on this weird Metal Gear Solid sneaking action for like an hour, which is completely out of place and once again just brought down the quality of the character and route.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
Despite the fact that I think Marshmallow has good characters, they unfortunately have routes that straight up potentially decrease the quality of the character. It doesn't help that Marmalade routes in general lead to heavy amounts of long H scenes. So basically, I would just say for visual novels like Marshmallow or Marmalade, just stick with the characters you want to romance most and or see H scenes most of and leave it at that. I could go on listing various popular or unpopular moege series, but I think you get the picture. These are by far the easiest to only read the character routes you care about and nothing else. Going into another no-brainer genre, I think Fandiscs are yet another type of visual novel where you could easily not read every route. What helps is that many of them aren't really that long, especially compared to the original visual novel it's based on. Usually most of them have a simple menu where you just simply pick a love interest after story you want to see, or pick a route for a brand new love interest. Considering these types of visual novels are specifically for fan service, there's no need to read an afterstory of a character you didn't like or a new heroine that didn't have a route originally. It's clear that Fandiscs are meant to be more for fluff and H scenes and barely have any real development for the most part. Even in weird cases like Sharin no Kuni's Fandisc, which straight up has a backstory route for the main villain Hozuki, many people have argued that you should only read that route since it's the only one that actually has story. And while I could definitely jive with that argument, you could also go the other way where if you don't care about Hozuki's backstory much, you could easily just go for the afterstory of one of the main heroines and ignore the others. And now we're going to go into a more interesting direction, visual novels with ladder route structures. Ladder route structures are my personal favorite route structures for visual novels, though sadly they are kinda rare. The only visual novels that are good that I'm aware of that have them are ones like Amatsutsumi, Aiyoku no Eustia, Kunado Chronicles, G-senjou no Maou, Newton and the Apple Tree, and a few others. The main reason I like them so much is because all of them have a true route by default, meaning there's a canon love interest that the main writer clearly wrote for. But on the other hand, these type of ladder routes make it so if you only about romancing the canon love interest, all of the other love interests still get character development that carry over into the true route, due to each main love interest getting their own main story chapter focused on them, something I wish more stories actually did. Of course, there are still branches even in a ladder route structure, but in this case, you would basically block off development for the main love interest and just only romance the heroine you branched off for. I tend to find that the romance arcs for these romance branches in the ladder routes tend to not be that interesting on the whole, since they already got the vast majority of the development in the main story. So I think it's pretty easy for many people to say to just only read the true route because you get the best of both worlds in terms of getting character development for everybody, but only properly romancing the main love interest that the writer was aiming for. The best example to show this off is G-senjou no Maou. Haru is the main girl who ends up becoming most people's favorite by far. It helps that she has the most plot relevance, and the way the plot develops clearly revolves around her in many ways. This tends to be the go-to reading recommendation for G-sen, because many people do not think the romance routes are that interesting and in a way contradict the true route ending. Although indeed, you could make the argument in the other direction. Many haters of G-senjou no Maou don't like how the twist of Haru's route contradicts the buildup of a certain theme. You could make the argument where if you like a certain heroine more than Haru, like for example with me, with Tsubaki, you could just read only 1 to 2 of the side heroine routes, despite the fact that the main mystery isn't solved, simply because it stays consistent with its themes and you get to romance the girl that you actually care about more. Going back to ladder routes though, there are very few cases where I personally think a romance route branch is actually more interesting than the actual true route. A perfect example of this is in Kunado Chronicles. Yuri was by far the best written character, both in her main route chapter as well as her romance branch, where she actually had additional character development, which I actually liked a lot, almost as much as her main story development. Conversely, I thought the other 3 main heroines ended up being a lot more boring than expected, which is doubly unfortunate for Haruhime, the main girl, who barely got any focus in her own route, and she's supposed to be the true route heroine. If I had known it was going to be like that, I probably would have just read Yuri's route and been happy. And now we're going to get into something even more controversial, drama-heavy visual novels with no route locks. I'm just going to go out on a limb. If there's no route locks in a visual novel, I do not see the point in forcing yourself to read all the routes. Unless routes unlock other routes, I tend to think developers make it so you could just potentially choose to read just the ones that you're interested in. A good one to talk about first is Musicus. This is a visual novel that's quite interesting in that it has 4 routes that go in wildly different directions. Despite this being a music-heavy visual novel, there's one route where the main character straight up does not get into a band. There's also a route that straight up is just pure depression, or utsuge, which is kind of just a long bad end compared to the other 3. Reading a band-focused visual novel with a route where the main character doesn't even get into a band might seem too weird for some people. Similarly, I know people who just don't like reading bad ends at all, so I could understand someone skipping it, even though I think that bad end is probably one of the better routes in the whole visual novel. Despite the drama-heavy nature of Musicus, at the end of the day, romance is still a decent part of the routes. So ultimately, I still think it comes down to just picking the heroines that actually interest you. Thankfully, in Musicus, I actually liked all 4 main heroines, but I could understand if someone didn't care for at least one of them. But there's a specific visual novel that is very drama-heavy that many people say to not read all the routes for. Totono, or You and Me and Her, A Love Story. To get the easy point out of the way, this visual novel has a lot of optional bad ends, which to be frank, I don't think really add much to the story and are very easily skippable for most people unless you're just a completionist. But more importantly, without getting into spoilers, Totono makes it a very important plot point to only choose one heroine. It's to the point where they make constant narration and monologues pointing out how choosing between just the two main heroines at different times is not a very moral thing to do, and a certain choice towards the end completely finalizes and honestly bashes you over the head with that point. Choosing the other main heroine branch would be a huge pain in the ass practically to get, but also would go against the themes of the visual novel. But of course, technically nothing is stopping you, it's just not that convenient to do on your own. While many people call Aokana a moege, I find that the amount of plot and drama is just enough to fit more in this drama section. Despite the moe art style, almost all the four main routes barely focus on romance, which I would think would be a big definition of what moege would be. In fact, many people come out of Aokana basically only liking Misaki's route and characters, since her route is the only one that actually has pretty unique development. Some people like Asuka the most instead purely because of her hype and moe dere factor, but just as many people don't like her Mary Sue-like nature. While Mashiro can annoy some people, I've seen some people who really like how her route ends up being the most romance-focused by far compared to the other three. And Rika...
Who?
Well, let's just say she and her route are seen as forgettable by many people, to the point where I would not blame many for this being the only route that they skip. Basically, my point is Aokana is the perfect example of a visual novel where I could completely understand if you only read one or two routes either due to heroine likability or to the reception of how well received the drama or flying circus or romance or lack of is in each of the routes. And now we're going to get into what might be the spiciest section of this video, slice of life heavy visual novels with route locks. To be honest, there are a whole bunch of visual novels with locked routes, and I'm not sure why they do. Some of them, I guess, are considered moege or at a minimum a slice of life, and some of the ways they lock routes just puzzles me, and you would think mentioning these would go against this whole video's ideas, since they require you to read certain routes to unlock certain routes or to unlock the true route even. But allow me to introduce you to an underrated feature of visual novels, the ability to skip all text, including unread text. Even when a visual novel stupidly forces you to read certain routes to unlock certain ones, especially true routes, this feature comes in handy when you want to read something that's locked behind something else. You don't want to read that something else first. A very good example of this is the original Maje de Watashi ni Koi Shinasai, or Majikoi. The original Majikoi has quite a number of routes. 5 main heroine routes, a true route, 3 side bro routes, and 3 side heroine routes. The 3 bro routes and side heroine routes require reading at least 1 to 4 main heroine routes, depending on the side route. While I like these side routes, I will admit these ones are generally pretty skippable, and I just personally don't see the point of hiding them behind reading a certain amount of main heroine routes first. These routes don't offer anything plot-wise and don't have any spoilers for other routes. If for some weird reason you wanted to read these routes over the main heroine ones, I would not blame you for just doing the skip all text feature that I just mentioned. But more interestingly, I've seen at least a handful of people who straight up do not like Christian Friedrich or Chris as a character. And what's worse is that even for Chris fans or people who like her, many people straight up dislike her route for having a stupid plot twist that happens in her first H scene. If you were to skip her route just for knowing what the first H scene entails, I would not blame you. Amazingly enough, I know someone who straight up skipped Chris's route using the skip all text feature just so he could get to the true route and not have to deal with Chris anymore. Another great example is Kinkoi Golden Loveriche. To me, the route locks here are even more baffling than in Majikoi. Similar to Majikoi, there's one side route for Aokana, who for some reason requires finishing at least one main heroine route, which is heavily confusing since Akana's route is completely standalone and does not spoil anything from the other main heroine routes. But more annoyingly, many people cite Ria's route as one of, if not the only good route in this whole visual novel. But unfortunately, it's treated as a true route, even though this is what people consider a moege for some reason, and you need to read all other 4 routes to unlock it. Yes, that includes Akane's side route for some reason, despite me saying earlier that it's completely disconnected from all the others. The only route that would make sense to unlock Ria's route for me would be Sylvie's, because they at least have something of a connection, but Reina's route barely has anything to do with Ria, and in my opinion also just kinda sucks. Elle's route is decent, but honestly not really that needed for Ria's or even Sylvie's. Kinkoi Golden Loveriche has a bunch of problems, and I personally think a restructuring of which routes would unlock others would have been very helpful, and I honestly personally wouldn't mind telling people to use the skip all text feature to only read the routes they care about, especially if they're only interested in Ria or the true route. Unfortunately, for some weird reason in the Fandisc Kinkoi Golden Time, they also have some weird route locks. This Fandisc has a brand new common route, which makes sense for getting routes for the 2 new main heroines in Mina and Ayaka, but it makes no sense that you need to finish the common route before you can see the after stories of the original 5 heroines. If you do not give a crap about Mina or Ayaka, I would not blame you for using the skip all text feature just so you can read the after stories. But even more importantly, for some reason, the alternate universe route, which I'll not spoil just in case, for some reason requires you to read every single other main route including Mina and Ayaka, which makes no sense to me because that route makes almost no references to these new routes. And if people were jumping into the Fandisc purely to read this alternate universe route, they are not able to right away, which makes no sense to me because it's pretty easily the best part of the Fandisc. Once again, another case where I can easily recommend just skipping all text of the routes you don't care about to unlock the ones you do care about. Going to a very niche but potentially important point. I know anime adaptations are generally frowned upon in the hardcore online visual novel community. But let's say you watched one of the more popular visual novel anime adaptations before reading the visual novel. So for example, Clannad and Steins Gate tend to be cited as 2 of the absolute best anime adaptations for visual novels, and hell, 2 of the best anime of all time in general. But what if you're one of those anime fans that's open to visual novels, and you find out shortly after that despite how good these anime were, the anime actually left out content from the original visual novel? More specifically, let's start with Clannad. I would say they incorporated every single route in some way pretty well, although they did kind of rush Tomoyo and Kyo's routes into OVAs. But did you know that Kappei's route is not in the anime whatsoever? I know people have mixed feelings on its quality, but what if someone who started with the anime recently watched it and doesn't want to reread the same stories that they saw in the anime and just only wants to read the Kappei route out of curiosity? That would be the perfect opportunity to just see what they missed out on, whether they like it or not. The same would apply to Steins Gate. The anime generally follows just the true route of the visual novel and did not tackle any of the non-true route heroine branches. What if you had just recently watched the Steins Gate anime and don't want to see the exact same ending again, but you were curious to just see how the non-true route heroines turned out? Well, that is something you could do by simply reading those routes and ignoring the true route if you were so desired and were curious. Final anime adaptation I'll talk about is the rewrite anime, which is generally considered not that good, but I personally think it's not really that bad and a good anime original teaser for the visual novel. But more importantly, Rewrite Season 2 covers the true routes of the visual novel pretty well, I'd say. So if you were to just read the original Rewrite visual novel immediately after watching the anime just to see what the whole common route has, since the anime didn't cover a lot of it, and the actual heroine routes because the anime didn't cover any of them at all, I think that could be enough. And that's all the major points I could think of. While I did make points related to route locks, if you are reading a story-heavy visual novel with unlockable routes, for the love of God, do not skip any routes because these are the small handful that make sense to read everything to get the proper build-up and all the story themes. Otherwise, I would say for many, if not most visual novels with routes, I tend to find that reading all routes is not 100% necessary and in fact could potentially be a detriment to your enjoyment for wasting time with characters you don't care about or straight up dislike. Of course, I'm not saying to almost always not read all routes in a visual novel. In fact, if you're interested or like all the love interests, then definitely do. I'm just saying I still feel it's necessary to force yourself to read everything for the sake of completionism. Hopefully through this video, you can at least see the position that I'm coming in. I, for the longest time, was one of those people who tried to make it a point to read every single route in every single visual novel I've read. But recently, I've tended to only read ones that I care about more and more, and I hope other people can at least consider the potential of doing this going forward. If you have any feedback on any points I made in this video, feel free to leave a comment below.